Richard Overy is a British historian who has spent most of his professional life writing books about war, primarily World War II. Professor Overy's current work is called Reign of Ruin: Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan. Liner notes on the cover of the book say, quote, "With the development of the B-29 superfortress in the summer of 1944, strategic bombing, a central component of the Allied war effort against Germany, arrived in the Pacific theater. In 1945, Japan experienced the three most deadly bombing attacks of the war." Professor Richard Overy is 77 and lives in Great Britain and Italy. He has written close to 30 books. Professor Richard Overy, when did you start wanting to write and think about war?
Well, that's a good question. In fact, my PhD I did at Cambridge many years ago was about the German war economy, and I think that's really when I started thinking about all those historical questions that are associated with war. And the Second World War is one of the world's biggest ever events, and there are still a great many questions that we still need to have answers to.
There are 23 books listed at the beginning of your book, Reign of Ruin, and then this would be the 24th, and I understand you've written others, but what was your first book?
Well, my first book was a book about the motor car manufacturer William Morris. I was asked to write a short business biography of Morris, but my first real book was The Air War, 1939-1945. It was published in 1980, many years ago now.
In this book, in the beginning, on your first page of the preface, I'll read you what you put there from General Marshall, George Marshall, on November the 15th, 1941. "If war with the Japanese does come, we'll fight mercilessly. Flying fortresses will be dispatched immediately to set the paper cities of Japan on fire. There won't be any hesitation about bombing civilians. It will be all out." Tell me about the difference between the fortress he was talking about at 1941 and the planes that actually ended up bombing in Japan.
Well, the Flying Fortress, of course, was not capable of reaching the Japanese home islands and wherever it was flying from. And its bomb load was relatively modest, actually. What they needed was a big bomber with long range, and Arnold had already set that in motion even before Pearl Harbor. And after the outbreak of war, he accelerated the program. But nothing could have been done really without the B-29.
How did America put the B-29 together?
Well, the B-29, I mean, Boeing was one of the leading military aviation producers, and Arnold and the Air Force, talked about what kind of aircraft they wanted in the late 30s, and they decided that they wanted an aircraft with long range, high altitude, a big bomb load, and there were various designs submitted, but Boeing had a lot of experience already with the B-17, and Marshall in the end had no hesitation in awarding Boeing the contract. But it was a difficult contract for Boeing to work on. There were thousands of modifications, thousands of technical problems. This was really at the very vanguard of military aviation technology. And it was actually put into operation against the Japanese before it was fully ready.
How many people, individuals, not military, civilians, were killed with the bombing in Japan?
Well, the bombing of Japan, there were 260,000 civilians and foreign workers and some soldiers as well, killed in the 5 months between March and August 1945. And then, of course, 200,000 who died as a result of the two atomic bombs. So if you put them together, it's almost 500,000 in the course of 5 months.
You have a quote from General LeMay. I'll ask you about him in a second. We knew we were going to kill a lot of women and kids when we bombed that town, meaning Tokyo. Had to be done.
Well, that was his view. I write in the book about the various motives behind the shift to incendiary bombing of the Central Japanese cities with high civilian casualties. There are a number. One was technical. LeMay found great difficulty in bombing precise targets, which had previously been American doctrine, from height because of the extreme winds experienced over Japan. And so in order to be able to make an impact, he decided to shift to low-level bombing by night instead of high-level by day, using only incendiaries to see what effect that would have. The second motive, he was being driven to do this by Arnold, by Neustadt in Washington. And the other motive really was to demonstrate that the Air Force could do something for the defeat of Japan. Up until then, the running had been made by the Navy and the Army. And Arnold was worried that the defeat of Japan would not really involve the Air Force. There were already question marks about whether the air campaign in Europe had really been worth it. And Arnold was desperate to win Air Force autonomy once the war was over, an independent Air Force. And he reasoned that if the Air Force could deliver the surrender of Japan without the Army and the Navy, that would be a strong case for producing an independent Air Force after the war.
Who was Arnold?
General Henry Arnold was the Chief of Staff of the United States Army Air Forces. It's always important to stress, I think, still that the United States Air Force was not independent. It was an Army Air Force, even though Arnold acted as if it was effectively an independent service.
So in history, where does Hap Arnold fit in all this? What's he known for?
Well, he fits into this particular story because from quite early on in in America's Second World War, Arnold had become increasingly frustrated with precision bombing doctrine and was attracted to what Bomber Command was doing in Europe, using incendiary bombing by night on German industrial cities. So he authorized a lot of research, both on incendiary bombing and on the tactics of incendiary bombing. He set up a committee of operation analysts, and they, from 1943, recommended the possibility of attacking the center of Japanese cities. The idea being that would somehow inhibit Japan's war economy. And Arnold approved all that too. And Arnold was one of the people pushing LeMay for results, encouraging LeMay to think about the possibility of incendiary bombing and what it might bring. So Arnold has quite a large role to play in this whole story.
I want to ask you to define certain kinds of bombing for those who don't pay attention to this subject very often. What is firebombing?
Firebombing is quite simply the use of a huge number of incendiaries dropped on a flammable target and have dropped repeatedly. In other words, for firebombing, both in the case of British Bomber Command and in case of the American Air Forces, firebombing meant sending in your aircraft one after the other, where they would drop their incendiary loads on a fire already visible. And that would produce an intense conflagration, quite beyond the means of the civil defenders or the fire service to cope. And that would have a devastating effect. And that's what firebombing was intended to be.
You've said it a number of times. I'll ask you anyway. What is an incendiary bomb?
Well, incendiary bomb is a small caliber bomb, often no more than 4 pounds, 6 pounds in weight, loaded with inflammable mixture and fused to set off a fire once it lands on something. And in the American case, they filled their incendiary bomb with napalm, invented and developed from 1942 onwards. And napalm was a much more effective gel incendiary than the incendiaries being used, for example, by the British. British didn't use napalm. Napalm, though, was ferociously efficient, so that dropping tens of thousands of napalm bombs on the center of Tokyo in March 1945 had exactly the effect that LeMay wanted. It burnt down 16 square miles of the city.
So after all the studying that I'm sure has gone on over the years since that war, what happened to the human being when incendiary bombs were dropped on him?
Well, when incendiary bombs are dropped, if you haven't got the means to save your house, and the Japanese didn't, they had flimsy wooden houses with easily combustible furniture inside. The best thing to do is to run away. And they did run away in very large numbers, but tens of thousands of them didn't manage. And what happened in the conflagration was that the fire moved very fast and very low. It was a conflagration, in fact, not a fast firestorm, which is often suggested. And it moved very fast and very low. And, as you were running away, the flames would catch up and overtake you and set you on fire. And that's what happened to tens of thousands of people in Tokyo that night. They just burnt to death.
We're talking about March 9th, 1945?
Yeah, March 9th, 10th, 45, yeah.
You say that when the war began, there were 6.8 million people in Tokyo, but by the end, even before bombing, the number was down to 2.8 million. Where did they go?
They all went to the countryside. They went to the countryside where many of them had relatives. Family networks were quite important in Japan. Or they went to smaller cities, thinking that smaller cities would be safe. They weren't safer. From June onwards, LeMay began a program of systematically attacking smaller cities in Japan, and destroyed a very large number of them. But they fled just out of the big cities to small cities and to the countryside. More than 10 million in the end.
I know this isn't important to you, but Americans may or may not remember that George Wallace ran for president and that General LeMay was his vice presidential candidate back in the early 60s. Next question on bombing. What's precision bombing?
Well, precision bombing is almost the entire opposite of firebombing, area bombing. Precision bombing, you usually use high explosive bombs with a few incendiaries mixed in. The idea being that you can destroy a military or military economic target, typically, for example, a factory, by dropping high explosive bombs, usually from high altitude. In the European War, bombs are dropped typically from 20,000 feet. In the war against Japan, they were being dropped from 30,000 feet. Now, the problem, of course, is it's not very precise because you've got a tiny target on the ground. You've got a plane moving at speed. To be able to hit a precise target from that height is extremely difficult. But nonetheless, the American Air Force insisted that what they were doing was precision targeting until they reached Japan, when it didn't work and they had to shift to something else.
Watching something that suggested the jet stream had an impact on bombing. Have you studied that?
Yeah, jet stream is very important. 30,000 feet, there was a very high wind permanent wind over Japan. And it pushed the B-29s up to 400 miles an hour, making it extremely difficult for the bombardier or the navigator to be able to hold the plane straight and to be able to drop bombs at any hope of accuracy. And in fact, most of LeMay's high-level precision attacks were ineffective. Later on, in the summer of 1945, LeMay tried precision attacks again alongside his firebombing, but this time he used a lot of incendiaries against factory targets, and he bombed from a much lower height. By that time, Japan's air defenses were pretty feeble, so he dropped bombs from a lower height, and that did have a bit more effect.
When the United States bombed Tokyo with the B-29, how many B-29s did we lose, and how many airmen did we lose?
Well, not very many. I mean, I can't remember the precise figure now. Six, I think it is, out of the total number. But there was almost no Japanese opposition. Japanese anti-aircraft fire went too high because the bombers were flying very low. And for most American airmen, the greatest danger was the aeroplane they were flying in, not the Japanese Air Force. Very large numbers were lost to technical faults of one kind or another, including that night, 4, I think, out of the 6. It was a dangerous plane to fly, but the Japanese Air Force, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was relatively ineffective.
So what did we have to do in order to be able to even fly the B-29 and to Japan? What islands did we have to take hold of?
Well, you couldn't get to Japan until you captured the Mariana Islands, Guam, Tinian, Saipan, and they were not captured fully until the summer of 1945. And indeed, when the bomber force first arrived, there was still Japanese holding out in some of the jungle and mountain areas. The fighting is still going on. But once they got there, the B-29 could reasonably comfortably fly from there to the southern Japanese home islands. But it was essential to capture Iwo Jima, and that also happened, of course, early in 1945, because Iwo Jima was halfway between. It could be a staging post. It was also where long-range American fighters were based. And a lot of the aircraft, if they had technical problems, as they did, could land on Iwo Jima, and then go on to Marianas after that. But that's what had to be aimed for, and something Arnold was very keen on. The faster Nimitz and the Navy could get there, and the Marines could capture the islands they needed, the sooner they'd be able to start their campaign.
Where did Paul Tibbets, who bombed Hiroshima with the B-29, where did he take off from?
He flew from Tinian, the island of Tinian, but all their training had been done in mainland United States or Cuba. And when they arrived on Tinian, they carried on training. They were training with mock bombs called pumpkins, just so that they would get used to the idea of dropping a particular bomb in a particular shape, in a particular way. Very intensive training. And we have to say that given how troublesome many of the B-29s were on operations, that the Enola Gay, when it went off to bomb Hiroshima on the 6th of August, performed extremely well. No problems. No problems with the bomb. Tibbets arrived there, dropped the bomb, came back. From that point of view, an operational success.
That plane is here in Washington, can be seen at the Udvar-Hazy Space Museum. Have you ever seen it?
No, I haven't seen it, but I know it's there. Yeah.
How were the cities chosen on where the 2 bombs were going to be dropped?
Well, early in 1945, in the spring, when they were drawing up plans for nuclear war, and I mean nuclear war, it's not just dropping a bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Once the bombs were coming on stream in September, October, November, the idea was that they would carry on using them. So they thought perhaps 3 bombs on Hiroshima. In fact, only 1 was necessary. And then they picked another 6 cities which were going to be bombed, have an atomic attack in the 2 or 3 months following that. And so they asked LeMay to not bomb a number of targets: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Niigata, Kyoto, Kokura, or at least not to bomb them heavily, because the important thing about the atomic bomb for the scientists, as well as for the airmen, the important thing about the atomic bomb was you could work out afterwards what effect it had. And if a city had already been bombed, firebombed, burnt down, you wouldn't be able to work that out. They wanted to be able to work out what the blast effects were, what the fire effects were, and so on. And so LeMay was asked not to bomb those cities because they were going to be reserved.
So if the two cities were chosen originally to be bombed by the two nuclear bombs, what were they?
Well, up until July, Kyoto, the historic ancient capital of Japan, was one of the target cities. And Stimson, the Secretary of War, was strongly opposed to that and managed to persuade Truman to get it taken off the list. So it was taken off the list. I mean, the key targets in the early list were Hiroshima and Kokura. Kokura was the site of Japan's largest arsenal. And Nagasaki was added to the list, but it was lower down. It was bombed only because Kokura was covered with cloud and industrial haze and couldn't be bombed. And so the second attack on the 9th of August, aimed at Kokura, ended up over Nagasaki.
So that they made that decision when they were in the air.
In the air, that's right, yeah. Also, when they arrived at Nagasaki, they couldn't see much. Finally, there was an opening in the cloud, and they could see, and they dropped. It wasn't on the aiming point. In fact, it was very close to the Catholic Cathedral in the middle of the main Catholic area of Nagasaki. And again, like the Hiroshima bomb, it worked perfectly.
Saw a documentary. I don't remember if I saw it in your book that on the Nagasaki bomb run, that by the time the B-29 got back to base, they only had 7 gallons of fuel.
Yes.
What happened on that trip?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they ran out of fuel only because they had to go all the way to Kokura, flew around a bit. They had to fly to Nagasaki, flew around until they could find the hole in the clouds, and then fly back. Paul Tibbets didn't have to do that. He was able to fly straight to Hiroshima and then straight back. So yes, it was always risky. Planes did run out of fuel, and by that stage they could land on Iwo Jima.
What's your take on the bombing in 1945? Did it bring the war to an end? Was that the specific reason?
Well, I mean, my book argues that we need to consider conventional bombing and atomic bombing. I mean, much of the literature focuses on the atomic bombs, assuming that those are the bombs responsible for bringing about Japanese surrender. Now, I argue that conventional bombing had much more impact, very damaging socially. It raised all kinds of political issues for the emperor and his elite. They worried that it would produce social breakdown, crisis like Russia in 1917. And when the atomic bombs dropped, for many Japanese, it was just really a continuation of the city busting program that had gone on for the previous 5 months. And we didn't know quite what the bomb was. Although, the Americans announced it was an atomic bomb, they thought perhaps that was simply propaganda. And it was 3 or 4 days before a report was produced which said it probably was an atomic bomb or perhaps another weapon. But by that stage, the emperor had already made his decision to accept the ultimatum sent to Japan from the Potsdam Conference that they would have to surrender.
The bombing of Tokyo in March, and then the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of those 3, where were the most people killed?
Well, most people were immediately killed in Tokyo. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, tens of thousands died in the days, weeks, months afterwards from radiation sickness and injury. So that in both cases, the final number of dead exceeded the dead in Tokyo. But Tokyo was bombed repeatedly, and the memorial to the bomb victims in Tokyo lists 104,000 dead in Tokyo over the course of the campaign. It's almost certainly higher than that, because with the firebombing in March, it was impossible really to work out how many people had died. Many of them simply reduced to piles of ash.
You've written a lot about the European front on this war. What was the difference in the impact of the B-17 used in Europe and the B-29 used in Japan?
Well, I think the B-29 clearly had much more impact. And once LeMay had changed strategy to area bombing, it had a huge impact on Japan. 60% of its urban area was destroyed in 5 months. The B-17 for the early stages in Europe was disappointing. In fact, LeMay was one of the figures who complained all the time that he was being given an impossible task, flying by day in formation against a target deep in Germany, with the Luftwaffe completely undefeated. Of course, they took exceptionally high casualties and had very little effect. It was only when Spaatz in 1944 insisted on changing strategy. First of all, top priority the Luftwaffe. Secondly, transport. Third, the chemical and oil industry. And that's really what brought the German war effort to a halt in 1945.
Britain and the United States bombed Dresden. Tell us about that. And what kind of plane did the British use?
Well, the bombing of Dresden happened, of course, only a few weeks before the bombing of Tokyo, but they're never put together. The British bombed Dresden, or Air Marshal Harris ordered the bombing of Dresden using huge numbers of Lancaster bombers, dropping incendiaries and creating a firestorm in the center of the city. Not really what he was asked to do. What the Americans did was to try to bomb the marshalling yard and the railway station the following day, but it was very difficult because the air was completely full of smoke still from the firebombing. The American view of area bombing was critical in Europe, although they practiced it against the cities of Japan. Many air commanders in US air commanders in Europe were critical of the British, and the firebombing of Dresden really achieved very little. What's interesting, I think, is that there was a very different reaction in the United States to the bombing of Dresden and the bombing of Tokyo, only 3 weeks apart. With the bombing of Dresden, one of the officers at Eisenhower's headquarters made a mistake of suggesting that the bombing had been aimed at refugees. And there was a fuss in America and in the press that somehow America had changed its strategy to bombing people rather than bombing factories. And Arnold had to issue a public statement that was not the case, that they were still targeting priority targets. But with the bombing of Tokyo, the day afterwards, or 2 days afterwards, the American press was full of it. And they were overjoyed that here was real punishment being brought back to the Japanese. And the New York Times made it clear that the target had been the most heavily populated area of Tokyo, where there were bound to be severe civilian casualties. Nobody, in fact, protested in the United States, but they had protested about Dresden. And I think what we can detect there really is a different attitude of the American public to Germans and to Japanese. There was strong hostility to Hitler and Nazism, but no real view that the Germans were in some sense subhuman, whereas Americans fighting in the Pacific had a strong view of the Japanese as barbarous, subhuman, monkeys. And so it lowered the threshold, I think, of whether you could kill civilians in large numbers or not. Against the Japanese, there was much less concern. Against the Germans, throughout the war, even though they were killing civilians, throughout the war, the priority for the American Air Force was precision bombing.
I know you've spent your life writing about this and thinking about it, but this is, I'm not so sure you've dealt with this in the book, but I know you've thought about it. How in the world has either the United States or Great Britain, after all these years, come back to being so friendly with Japan and Germany, with the people? I mean, we trade, we get along, we travel, we visit. And when you read your story about it, it's horrendous.
It seems something of a paradox. In the German case, of course, after the end of the war, Western Germany was terrified of the Soviet Union. The last thing it wanted was to become communist, and so having the Americans and the British as occupiers, willing in the end to reintegrate Germany into the Western world, was basically what Germans wanted. So that, whatever hostility there had been between them very quickly evaporated. The Japanese story is more difficult because the Japanese were terrified of the Americans. They were told by propaganda that the Americans were monsters, that when they arrived it would be terrible, all women would be raped, and so on and so on. But in fact, MacArthur was a good choice as Supreme Commander. He took a tolerant view of the Japanese despite everything. He tried to reduce the antagonism between the two peoples. The Japanese government soon recognized that it was much to their advantage that the Americans were there in Japan and not Stalin's Soviet Union. That nearly happened at the end of the war. And the Japanese made every effort to avoid the threat of communism. And they could see what had happened in Eastern Europe, so they didn't want that to happen to Japan. And so in both cases, the Japanese very quickly accommodated themselves to the American presence and came to rely on America for security, as they still do. Yeah.
Did you ever serve in the military?
I didn't, no. I have to say, I've been a very poor soldier. Not that I ever got flat feet, but I'm not great with authority, unfortunately. Yeah.
How did you teach yourself about this business of war?
Well, I mean, like any subject, really. I mean, the historian goes out and he finds the material that he wants, and he spends his time reading, researching, going to the archives, and so on. I mean, it would have been the same if I'd been studying, I don't know, the development of the steel industry or the Crusades. A historian had to get out there and get your mind around what you're looking at. Put yourself in that place. It's a leap of imagination that you've got to undertake. But I think most professional historians can do that.
Where have you taught?
Well, I've taught all over the place. I taught in Cambridge to start with, and I moved to King's College, London, where I taught for 25 years, and then to the University of Exeter, which is a small university in the west of England, which has become a very high-ranking university. In 10, 15 years, it's become a very good university. And I retired from teaching 10 years ago, and although I've been asked to come back and do some teaching, not least in the States, I've had enough teaching. I'm happy writing books.
How much interest is there still, especially in Great Britain, about World War II?
Oh, enormous interest. I mean, people think that the Europeans think the British are obsessed with the war. They record every anniversary and so on. They print stamps about the war all the time. There's huge public enthusiasm for books and television documentaries and so on and so on. But having said that, they're much less interested in the war in the Pacific or in the war in China, unlike in the United States. I have to say that doing the publicity for this book in Britain, I found actually more interest in the Pacific War and the issue of the bombing of Japan than I expected, because it isn't high profile in the UK. I think what attracts the audience in Britain is still the atomic bomb, because above all, this is the most extraordinary thing at the end of the war, and it's something which has hung over our heads ever since.
You suggest that the Americans started planning to have a war with Japan in the early 1900s?
Yeah. The Army and Navy Board in 1906 drew up what was called War Plan Orange, which they modified and revised over the course of the next 30-odd years. But yes, they had to imagine what would happen if they found themselves at war with Japan. And they were shocked into doing that by the Japanese victory over Russia in the 1904-1905 war. Suddenly the Japanese become a major power in the Pacific region, where the Americans had interest. And that's what first prompted it. They didn't, it was a contingency plan. They were not going to make war against the Japanese. But by the late 1930s, War Plan Orange was, effectively what they would do if if war broke out. And indeed, that's what they did do. Fought their way across the islands of the Pacific till they could get near enough to drop bombs and avoid getting involved in war in China.
Near the end of your book, you say that at the United Nations, a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was introduced in July of 2017 with the effect from January 2021 and was signed by 122 countries, though neither Japan nor the United States joined the signatories. I looked online today and found that the 9 countries of the world that's supposed to have nuclear weapons, Russia, Israel, India, Pakistan, Great Britain, France, USA, China, and North Korea, didn't sign it either.
No, that's right. Yeah, well, I mean, if you've got the weapons, you either give them up and say that it was pointless having them, or you keep them in the expectation that in complete emergency, it may be that you have to use them. I mean, I find it difficult to understand why the smaller powers want nuclear weapons. They can't effectively use them. And if it did, it would be, extremely dangerous for both sides. But they keep them anyway and don't want anyone to take them away.
Which of your books, and as I said earlier, you have at least 24 that I know of, which of them was a bestseller or that sold better than any of the rest of them that you might recommend people would read?
Well, the biggest seller in hardback was Blood and Ruins, the book that was published 3 years ago, nearly 4 years ago now. Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War, 1931-1945. And that's my global history of the 1930s and 40s.
Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War, as you say. And then when did you write Why War?
Well, I wrote Why War between that and this book on Japan. I've been very busy the last few years. I mean, that was both Why War and Reign of Ruin, the books that I had at the back of my mind for some time. And I wanted to write Why War, and it was published by coincidence with 2 major wars being waged, one in Gaza, one in Ukraine. But when I started writing, of course, those wars were not yet going on. So it seemed a rather timely book in the end. Reign of Ruin, I hope, won't be quite so timely. I hope we're not going to see the real risk of nuclear war, despite all the rhetoric that's going on.
What is your take on the current situation with 9 countries at least having nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean, I wish they didn't, of course. I mean, people have been asking me all the time, is the risk greater? Is the Third World War going to happen? I just think that, irrational though some of the politicians involved actually seem, everybody knows that in a nuclear exchange, nobody wins. Thermonuclear war is catastrophic, destroys everything. And, even though Putin, Lavrov and others keep on making this threat, it's a threat. It's a hollow threat. They are not going to unleash nuclear war because they know the risks.
In your book on chapter 3, Why the Atomic Bombs, you have in your epigraph a comment by Robert Wilson, Los Alamos scientist, 1971. At Los Alamos, we worked frantically so that a weapon would be ready at the earliest moment. Once caught up in such a mass effort, one did not debate every moment. In Hamlet fashion, its moral basis, every faculty, every thought, every effort was directed to making that a success. Your take on Los Alamos and the process of building this bomb?
Well, I mean, building the bomb was extremely complex. The engineering was, unique, new. And one of the things I've argued in my book is that we've always played down, it seems to me, the role of the scientist in providing the bomb. There wouldn't have been a bomb if Oppenheimer and the team at Los Alamos had not worked, day and night to try and find a way of engineering the bomb effectively. And Oppenheimer drove them, but they were willing to be driven. All the evidence we have shows that they desperately wanted to be able to show that they could make a bomb And having made it, of course, it was then very important to show that it worked. And I think that we play down the extent to which the scientists also pushed towards the use of the bomb. They wanted to see how it worked, and they were desperate to produce it before the war ended so that they could see.
The United States took Oppenheimer's security away from him after the war. Why?
Yeah. They did, yeah. I mean, there'd always been lingering suspicions that he was communist-minded. And indeed, he had flirted with the American Communist Party before 1941. But he always professed his patriotic credentials. And I think with some justification. And he was the person who drove the scientists who insisted that a bomb could be produced, and once it had been produced, that it could be dropped. And from that point of view, his patriotism seemed pretty clear. But, he lost his security clearance in the McCarthy years, when even rumours of flirtation with communism was enough to penalise you.
At the meeting in Potsdam in Germany, you say there was 10 days between that meeting and the dropping of the atomic bomb. How much do you think Stalin knew at that time? And I can't remember who was there from Britain, because they'd just had a change in government.
Yeah. Well, Clement Attlee took over from Churchill. Yeah.
How much did they know about the bomb, and how much did they know it was coming within 10 days?
Well, Churchill and Attlee, I mean, the British leadership didn't know a lot about the bomb, and they were not. I mean, the British side was not involved in the operational planning, military operational planning for the use of the bomb. Stalin knew a lot, of course, even the results of the tests in July, because of the spy network. He knew a lot more than Churchill, in fact. And although the argument has it that, that Stalin's knowledge or the bomb was supposed to inhibit Stalin, it was supposed to show him that the Americans had, amazing scientific power, and he wouldn't do the same in Asia that he'd done in Europe, but it was not the case. He already knew about it, but what he worried about was that it might end the war in Japan, and therefore he would have to speed up seizing territory, taking the fruits of what Roosevelt had promised him at Yalta before the war actually ended. And indeed, in the end, the Red Army was still fighting Japanese soldiers on September the 5th, 3 days after the formal surrender ceremony.
Near the end of the book, in the aftermath chapter, you say that ethical concerns did not worry LeMay. In his memoirs, he wrote about Tokyo. We knew we were going to kill a lot of women and kids, and we bombed that town. Had to be done, as I quoted earlier. How about the rest of the United States and the officials over the years? Anybody concerned about this? Have there been many meetings and studies and all that done in the years since the war?
Not a lot, actually. There were people, high-ranking people, Eisenhower is perhaps the most well-known, who didn't like the dropping of the bomb or opposed to it, as was Lee, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Roosevelt's close advisor. But opinion polls in the United States in the aftermath of the bombing, found very large majorities in favour. And indeed, there's always been a majority in favour from then right down to the present day. Now, of course, there is more criticism of the bombing, discussion about whether it was necessary or not, and so on. But for the first decades after 1945, much less soul-searching than one might expect.
I'm going to read a couple of sentences, not for the morbidity reasons. It's not good, not fun. You put it in your book, and I want to ask you why. It was from Tsutomu Yamaguchi, obviously Japanese. And you say here, was horrified by the sight of 5 shivering boys. And this is in light of the bombing in Tokyo. Here's the quote from him. Blood was pouring in streams from deep cuts all over their bodies, mingling with their perspiration, and their skin was burned deep red like the color of cooked lobsters. At first, it seemed strangely that their burned and lacerated backs and chests were growing green grass. Then I saw that hundreds of blades of sharp grass had been driven deep into their flesh by the force of the blast." Unquote. Why did you choose to put that in the book?
Well, this was Hiroshima, not Tokyo. I wanted to find, first of all, a memory of the bombing, which was not widely publicized in the other history books. I mean, there are books on Hiroshima and Nagasaki which are full of detail about what happened. I wanted to choose one that was not well known, but I only wanted to choose one or two because you can go on talking about the horror of Hiroshima and the horror of Nagasaki. I just think you need one to illustrate it.
What are you writing now?
Well, I've started writing another book, which is not really to do with war, or at least it is rather tangentially. I'm writing a book called Fascinating Fuhrer, and it's about why Hitler has played such an important part in the last 80 years in the media, in discussions about politics, in discussions about the morality of war and so on and so on. But Hitler is everywhere, where the other dictators are not. And I really want to try and explore that history, the history of Hitler after 1945, and the reasons why we are still fascinated, in inverted commas, with Hitler. I think it's an important question, but at the moment Hitler won't go away.
Well, as you know, you turn on, at least in this country, you turn on television and any of the YouTube or streaming services and all that, we'll talk about Hitler day in and day out.
Yeah.
Does the same thing happen in Great Britain?
Yeah. No, exactly the same thing.
What's your early sense, and I don't want you to have to give away your book, but what's your early sense of why Hitler is so dominant after all these years?
I think actually one of the reasons is simply that it's the scale of what he did. Coming from nowhere to dominate the German people and to launch massive German imperialism, and then to be responsible for the greatest crime in world history. People are fascinated by, I think, that simply the scale of the story, the horror of the story. I mean, it's something which, for most people, it's difficult to get their head round. But it's something which people are interested in, fascinated by, need explanations for. And that's not the case with other dictators. I think the other thing is that because this is a phenomenon which has become more marked in the last 20 or 30 years, it's also a question of distance. For many younger people who play around with the Hitler idea on YouTube and so on and social media, that this person is separated from the reality. Everybody knew about him in the 1940s, the evils that he was associated with. And I think that it's become disappointingly a process really of taming Hitler so that the media can cope with Hitler and what Hitler does. And they also sense that there's a popular appetite, curiosity about Hitler, which there isn't about Mao or Saddam Hussein or Stalin. And I think once it got going, it was very difficult to turn off. It's very difficult to turn off now. As you say, every time you put the television on, there's a Hitler documentary.
Who killed more people, Stalin or Hitler?
Well, I'm often asked that. I say it's not a question that's easy to answer. I think almost certainly Hitler, if you want an answer, but I'm not doing the arithmetic.
When you hear, though, the figure between 75 and 80 million people were killed in World War II, do you find that to be accurate?
Oh, no, I think that's too high. We're constantly revising the figures for one reason or another, also adding in people who died in famines and so on and so on. So people who die as a result of the war, I put it 60-something million. I think 75, 80 million is too high. If you take the two world wars, you take that 30-year war, 1914, 1945, yes, then we are looking at 80 million.
I doubt if you've ever been asked this question, and I'm smiling when I say that. What do you think the chances are that there will be another world war?
Well, I think the chances are slim, I'm pleased to say. I don't think we're going to see the end of war. I mean, we've got 2 wars going on at the moment, which were unexpected and very large in scale. There are plenty of other areas of tension in the world. There are wars going on in Myanmar, in Sudan, in the Congo. So war is not going to disappear. But it's more likely to be war between, a civil war, or war between 2 close neighbours. But I think we're not going to see a return to general war as we had in the 20th century.
The book is called Reign of Ruin, and our guest has been Richard Overy, professor, retired now, emeritus. And this is about Tokyo, Hiroshima, and this surrender of Japan, and a lot more. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.